Hello and welcome to the Instructor's Guide to Delivering Virtual Training. In this session, you will learn ways to evaluate if your content is VILT friendly, common tools used for virtual delivery, pitfalls to avoid in conducting virtual sessions, using a host or producer to manage your environment, engaging a virtual learner, and quick tips to consider as you start delivering your programs remotely. With us today presenting from Infopro is Clinton Wingrove. Clinton delivers training to all instructors on how to create an organized learning experience. His facilitation and coaching expertise has been delivered across classrooms around the globe and in virtual sessions attended by thousands. Clinton is well-versed in a variety of management, leadership, and professional development topics, including communication, influencing and negotiating skills, presentation facilitation skills, and personal development for emerging leaders and executives. So let's please welcome Clinton to the session. Clinton, I will bring up your first slide. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed, Mel, and welcome everyone. Glad to see so many on board. This is a really exciting topic. It's something that I'm quite passionate about, so I hope that I can help you benefit from the experiences I've had. Clearly, there's a number of reasons for going virtual, and probably most of us who are on today, it's because of the issue of contagion. All of a sudden, we find ourselves all working from home. However, that's not the main reason for going virtual. It's merely one of them. Many organizations have been using virtual for years as a result of travel cost, reduced time, lack of a meeting space, and even the ability to just share materials globally, which otherwise would be quite difficult in a face-to-face environment. We've also seen organizations go virtual because of the convenience. Don't have the travel time, it's much more accessible, it's more localized, and again, it can be on demand. But I also want you as your professional trainers to also think about the return on investment anyway. Virtual training does have some upsides. You can include a much wider range of presenters, bringing them in from multiple locations. So even today, the three of us have spoken are all geographically dispersed, and even if flights were going, it would take us hours to connect. And also there is a scope for a different way of learning, a different variety of experiences, and I'm going to come back to that in a later slide and mention that. There's broadly two main types of web-based training, and I want to be careful. We're going to focus on one of them today. We're going to focus on synchronous training. This is where all participants participate at the same time, because we're talking about transferring something from a face-to-face into a virtual environment, and typically face-to-face by definition is synchronous. Just be aware though, in the same way that Mel is recording this, it is possible to record training, which means you can do asynchronous training. There's different skills required for that, or should I say additional skills over and above what we're going to be covering today. So today we are making an assumption that you understand basic adult learning concepts. How do people learn? They need to have activity, etc., etc. We're not going to teach you things you already know, and we're going to assume that you will typically be delivering those synchronous sessions. And of course, sometimes you may actually use a blend, which is why sometimes I say there are three types. But what's the real difference in virtual? And here we need to look at this because it's quite critical for some of the things I'm going to explain later. Firstly is the level of attention. It's now fairly generally accepted, and I've done a lot of international research myself which prove these figures. If you're in a face-to-face environment, at any one point in time, about 50% of the people are really paying attention. The others are thinking about what they might say next. They're thinking about what you might say next. They're thinking about distractions. Their cell phones just pinged. A whole variety of things distract them. On video, which is what you'll often be doing when you're doing virtual sessions, it drops to about a third. And on teleconferences, it drops even as low as my research showed just around 24%. That's really important because we've got to be aware that if we're on video, we have to achieve a greater impact than we would if we were in a face-to-face situation just to get what we're saying heard. We'll come back to how we say it in just a moment. We also know that retention is very, very directly related to the level of engagement. So it's not just about hearing things. We need to engage people. We need to ensure that they are thinking about what we've shared with them. And one of the big dangers, for example, with webinars, and this is a webinar, so this is a danger I face here, is how much of that are you going to retain? Which is why we make available a recording afterwards. So if you forget something, you can come back and look at it. Again, be aware if you're running virtual training, what are you doing to enable people to retain what you're sharing with them? And then the other point, which is now a really hot topic for research, is the fact that whilst we may communicate visually through video, so it looks as though we're connecting with each other, we can hear each other, we can see the facial expressions, the assumption is that that's equivalent to face-to-face. There is now some serious research going on asking the question whether or not we are actually achieving the same level of emotional connection. And some people argue that this lack of or reduced emotional and cognitive connection may be one of the reasons on things like social media that we see such increased levels of abuse and negative behavior. So these are some of the things that we need to account for. And that takes us to the issue of pitfalls. So what are the pitfalls that we face? And Mel, is it possible to bring the poll up and show that just temporarily across this slide? And now, by the way, you see the advantage of having a host. Mel mentioned that I was going to comment on the issue of hosts versus presenters. Mel is a host, so behind the scenes, Mel is making sure that the technology works. Mel is making sure the display is correct. Mel is making sure that the chat is being monitored. So just a quick an aside, a tangential point. Be aware, having someone supporting you like that is invaluable. Interesting to see that the pitfalls that you've picked, and we're going to touch on all of these as we go through. Number one, not preparing participants in advance. 112 people picked that. 160 picking technology issues. You'll notice that those of you who logged in early, we spent a fair amount of time double checking that everything was working. Mel, as the host, has logged in twice so that if one fails, we have another one. Lack of attention and interest has come out high. That's a great one because that's a really important one. I'm going to cover that with you later on. And then further down, distractions. Again, something I'm going to cover. So really interesting to see you're highlighting already some of the really hot pitfalls and problems that you can actually face when you're running virtual training. I'm going to touch on all of these now so that we can see how we can handle them. So, okay, can we take that away, please? Thank you, Mel. See, it's as if by magic, I've got this magic Mel button. All of you need a Mel. So what we're seeing here is there's lots of issues, and it's not just the translation of the content. You notice I've only put one in there, which is the amount of content for time that's directly related to that. I am, by the way, going to cover later, is your content suitable, which clearly is a question. But a number of different issues here that we need to face. Let's start, though, with that technology issue. The technology is constantly advancing. You'll notice that we're using Adobe Connect. It's a platform that we've found extremely useful. It's particularly useful when you do have experienced hosts like Mel. It's not a platform to be entered into lightly. I was invited to attend last night a very important meeting. I connected through the platform only to discover that the person running it, it was the first time they'd ever run a session using that platform. If I'd known, I probably wouldn't have connected, because something like 17 or 18 minutes in, they were still trying to work out how to do things. So the important thing is, choose a platform that's that supports your specific needs, not what everybody else recommends. Their needs might be different, and they might have a different level of technical skill. Also, be careful about sophisticated tools. It's very tempting to say, well, this is a great platform because it's got whiteboards and you can choose different colors, and everybody can write on them, and we can go into breakout groups and we can conduct polls. These things are absolutely great if you know how to use them, and if you don't, it really does damage your entire session, let alone your own reputation. The other thing is, test it, test it, test it. And in fact, I would even say, if it works, test it again, because it probably hasn't tripped you up yet. So have a plan B. So you'll notice, those of you who logged in early, Mel mentioned she's logged in twice. That's a plan B. If one of her PCs fails, immediately another one can pick it up. We've got Nolan online as well, so if Mel's fails again, that can be handled. So we need to be careful with our choice of platform. And I'm noting there's some questions coming up. Okay, yeah, the questions that have come up so far, I'm going to be answering in a short period of time, so I'll just keep an eye on those. In terms of platforms, there are a whole variety. Probably the most common ones are Microsoft Teams, which typically comes with Microsoft MS365, the Office. Webinar Jam is another quite common one. Zoom, which is very popular, certainly for smaller type training programs. WebEx, GoToMeeting, Google Hangouts, and Adobe Connect. There are lots of others for very simple applications. Probably things like Zoom and Webinar Jam and Microsoft Teams are appropriate. For larger, more complex ones, Adobe Connect, Webinar Jam, and Microsoft Teams are probably more appropriate. So again, really important though that you look into them. So the question is, what do you look for? And up on the screen, I'm showing some of the things that you want to look for. Be aware that in certain parts of the world, people will typically log in with their mobiles, their cell phones or iPad minis. That does mean to say you need to use a platform that is very mobile friendly. Some of them completely distort the layouts, etc., which makes those difficult to use. Use of audio. If you want people to be able to speak, does it support telephone and or voice over IP or combinations? And if you're going to use some of the more sophisticated tools like breakouts, check to see whether in fact it will accommodate a mix of them. Some of the platforms, everybody has to be on one or the other. Video, of course, very, very useful. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then again, visual aids. Does it support PowerPoint or any other tool that you might be using? So the Apple tools and various Prezi and so on. And also, does it allow you to control who doesn't share screens or documents? So again, it's important that you know which of these you may want to use. And I'll come back to some further points about them later. Does it allow chat, public and private? So can you control that? So Adobe Connect, for example, we've got the ability on screen here to support everyone chatting with everyone. You can also chat with individuals. You won't see this, but we also have the ability as presenters, we can chat with each other without the participants seeing. That helps you if there's multiple people participating in the training. You saw a quick example of a poll. Does it support polls? Can you put the questions in easily? Can you have multiple formats? We asked you to pick 3 things. You can have only picking 1, picking as many as you like. You can even have the option to put in narrative comment on Adobe Acrobat. some of the platforms don't support the same extent. Breakout rooms. You've probably heard of virtual breakout rooms. Not all of the platforms support these. Zoom now has recently added that as a feature. Webinar Jam has got it. Microsoft Teams and Adobe Acrobat definitely have. More and more are adding them. Just find out how easy they are to use. With Adobe Acrobat, it's definitely advantageous to have a host working with you so that the host can create the little breakout rooms and assign people to them. And then document handling. Can you upload and download documents? This morning, just before we started, we needed to upload the new slide deck, so some of you will have observed us actually doing that. And whiteboards. Everybody loves whiteboards until they try to use them, so you need to be very careful. Whiteboards are great tools. It's where people can actually type and draw on the screen from where they are, and then you all see it. The issue is, does it easily allow you to control what's happening? Because people can very easily start typing over things that each other have done, editing it, etc. So whilst it appears like a great tool, be careful how you use it. It's very often a good idea for only one person to be actually using the whiteboard tool, and again, I'll come back to that one later. This is an important one, attendance registration. Do you have to give people usernames and passwords? Can anybody access your training? Can you allow some people in early, like the presenters, and some people hold people in a lobby room, etc. So that's a really important one if you're running training, so you have control over who can get in, when they can get in, and what they can do. Somebody just posted a question about what is a breakout group. I'll pick that up right now while we're on this screen. You know, when you go to conferences, you'll often say to people, right, what I want you to do is to split into groups of 5. I want you to go off into your breakout rooms, discuss the following topic, and then when we come back together, we'll debrief what you've discussed. A breakout group in a virtual environment is exactly the same. In a breakout group, what you can do is you can assign people into different groups, and all of a sudden, through their virtual connection, they're only speaking to, chatting with, and seeing on screen what the people in their subgroup are seeing. So you can break them out into 3, 4, 5, 6, however many groups that you like. So, and while they're in those groups, as the presenter or the host, you can actually visit them. So you can drop into each of the groups separately. You can listen into the conversation. You can contribute to it. You can look at any whiteboard they're writing on. So you can participate in those breakout groups, again, when you're in there only with that subgroup. And then you decide as the trainer or the host when to pull it back. So we could, for example, put you all into breakout groups now, ask you to discuss something, and then pull you back. And then obviously when you pull them back, it's like them coming into the main meeting. The only difference compared to a physical meeting is you can actually pull them back. In physical meetings, sometimes they just disappear and you never see them again. So actually breakout groups in a virtual environment is probably better than face-to-face. Okay, I'm just quickly glancing at some of the comments just to see if we've got any questions. No, I think we're okay for the moment. Mel will actually catch my attention if there's something that I specifically need to see. Okay, Nikos actually asked an interesting question. Nikos asked, how important is it that the participants can see you? I would say if you're running a virtual training program, as I say, this is a webinar and we know we could have a very large number of participants. If you're running a virtual training program, I would definitely recommend, numbers willing, that you allow people to see you. And I would recommend, as much as you can, that you allow them to see each other. And I'll comment on that in just a moment. Again, it's moving it from that. If you don't have the video live, it's equivalent to a telephone conversation. So you are significantly reducing the level of engagement and the level of retention of material. So definitely, if you can have it available, and that would be strongly advised in all situations. The only thing you would need to be careful is in certain parts of the world where you know there are bandwidth issues that can actually suck their bandwidth. And you'll remember Melissa mentioned bandwidth as an issue. Going back to some of the features to look for, again, I finished on sort of controlled access. Do you have control not only over who can register or not, but also who can get in, when can they get in, and what can they do? You definitely need that ability. Does it support multiple roles? Can somebody act as a host behind the scenes, handling some of what you want done, whilst you actually focus on the training and the engagement with the participants? So that really is important. And then lastly, 3 or 4 of you asked before we managed to mention it, does the system support recording the session? And there's 2 or 3 things here. The obvious one is, does it record the actual video and slide deck and audio? But the other one is, does it record the chat? Because depending on what you are doing with people, depending what you are covering with them, you may also want to record the chat, because that may be where a lot of the information is being shared if you are using chat as a learning vehicle. Anis has just popped up a question: what would be suggested limit to the number of people attending a session? If you're running a webinar, and on today we're talking very much about transitioning a face-to-face learning module to a virtual module, so typically the same things apply. I would generally, if I'm running a virtual learning module, if I'm actually running a training session where I'm looking for skill development, I would typically then limit the numbers to round about 16, depending on the content. Might be 24 for some things, might be fewer for others. If I'm running a webinar where you are speaking to people and showing slides, and your maximum interaction is some chat like we have here, then basically it's as many as you want to allow in. But if it's genuinely you are training with the purpose of them going away, having acquired a new skill, I would say 16-ish is a good guideline. And that's a pretty good segue into my second point. So my first thing is, think about your technology. Be careful about advisors. There's lots of people who overnight, as a result of COVID-19, have become experts in virtual. You work out what you need, make a good choice of platform to use. The second one then is initial engagement. What we need to be aware of is when we move to a virtual environment, and I think in the US, those of you in the US, I know we've got a lot from Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Los Angeles and so on, there's a phrase now that's used, it's called flipping the training. In a face-to-face environment, typically people come to the training session to learn. They may have done some pre-reading before they come, but they're primarily at the training session to learn, to apply, to master, or to learn the skills, not to master. They then take that away, and back at base with the follow-up work, they try it out. So effectively, we teach them in the session, and then they go away and apply. In a virtual environment, you're nearly always, if you're going to be effective, you're actually doing it the other way round. What you should be doing is engaging the participants in advance so that they actually learn about the topic before they come. Because then when they come, with typically a reduced amount of time, now you engage them with the material, you help them to apply it, you personalize it. And that's really important, because that makes the session you run richer. So it's really important that you engage participants in advance, preferably send them pre-work. Don't, for example, in a virtual training session, show videos. Let them watch the videos before they come, and then in the session, bring out the learning points from them. Send them materials that they can read. Send them case studies. Ask them to prepare. Get them to even talk with their boss or colleagues about what they can learn from the session when they come. Warn and prepare them in advance about the environment, the tools and the platform. So warn them this is going to be a highly interactive session. You can't have noise in the background. Please make sure your dog's in the other room and that someone's looking after the children. Make sure that they've got an appropriate headset and screen that they can use, and make sure obviously that they've tested the platform. Some of the platforms require plugins which antivirus software may question, so you need to get them to check that before the session. Get them to address technical issues quickly, and this is where having a host is useful. If this was a training session, Mel would have ensured and checked with each of you individually that you had good quality sound, that you could see the screen, that things were functioning. Really important that you do that, and preferably, as I say, if you can, in advance. Also minimize your own introductions. You'll probably have been surprised at how brief the introduction was, and congratulations, Nolan. And that's on a webinar. In a training session, even more important. People want to get into the material. They don't want to hear your life history. So if it's important they know who you are, send it to them in advance. And then actively on board. You'll notice that as those of you who logged in early logged in, we started chatting with some of you, picking up where you were from. We were trying to engage you to make sure that you transitioned away from that dreadful list of emails that you've still got to clear. We'd pulled your attention away from what you were doing before, because until you've engaged with us, actually anything we do is not worthwhile. That takes us to solution 3. So having got people prepared, wanting to attend the session, technically capable and aware of what they might face, now we've actually got to get their attention. And what we've got to realize is we're competing with lots and lots of things, and I'll talk about distractions in a moment. So the question is, how are you going to get people's attention? How are you going to get them to listen to you? And you say, well, isn't it obvious they've logged in? yeah. I have a video of a board of directors in New York where they were on a meeting, and one of the boards of directors actually stood up in the middle and started adjusting his attire. We won't go into any more details than that. People lose attention. So it's really important. This is why it's important to have audio during a training session, interact with people, get them speaking, engage with the video. And in particular, we very often for webinars want to have a very consistent theme to the slides. We want it to all look nice. We want it to be like a book. If you're running a training session, every time the screen changes, you want to grab people. You've got to get their attention back in case they've had a ping on their cell phone, they've heard a noise, something's gone past the window. So again, think in terms of how you're going to use visual aids, and that's not just PowerPoint. How you're going to use different looks and feels to the slide so their eye is caught by it and they come back. Keep them pithy, keep them relevant, keep them memorable. Again, the visual aids can be an aid memoir. And then delivery style. In a face-to-face environment where people want to be there, you can have a relatively passive style, nice quiet delivery. You talk in a relative monotone because you're giving them activities to do. But in a virtual environment, you're competing with where they are. So there is a need for having some variety. And one of the things some people who move to virtual training do is they join something like Toastmasters, for example, to get practice in how to use vocal variety, change their pace, and shift their apparent level of enthusiasm. I always remember the saying, if I don't sound enthusiastic, why the heck should you be? And then things that you can do to get people's attention in addition to that. Address people by name. The one thing that most people have heard the most often since they were born is their name. So again, one of the things you'll notice, those of you who logged in earlier, before I mentioned Atlanta, I mentioned the name of the person who was in Atlanta. Before I mentioned the northwest of England, I mentioned the name of the person, because that will catch their attention. We can also use the tools in Adobe Connect. We've got the little hands up tools, and most platforms have those. We've used interactive chat. I know Mel is actually communicating with many of you right now on chat. And notice there's an upside and a downside. The upside is through the chat, Mel is capturing the individual attention of one or two of you. I've got to compete with that because others of you are watching the chat rather than listening to me. So again, when you're training, be really conscious of how you blend these two together. And sometimes you may actually want to take the chat away so that you focus on the really important points and then pull it back when you need to. Polls we've already mentioned, and breakout groups we've mentioned. Two or three other points to think about. Be aware that if people are only going to be really attentive approximately a third of the time, you need to repeat your key messages at least twice to increase the probability that it gets caught. Now, I am a statistician and I know that that's not foolproof, but it's a lot better than just saying something once. Also, make sure that you focus on your specific content. You'll notice when I moved to solution 2, I reiterated solution 1 that we just mentioned. We're now on solution 3. You'll remember solution 2 was how do you get people's initial engagement before they connect with you. In solution 3, we're talking about how do you get their attention when they're here with you. I'm focusing on specific content that matters. The last thing about attention is personalize the content. So when you're running a training program, let's say you're teaching them an interpersonal skill, let's say, it's very well worthwhile having an activity where you ask them to work out how that applies to them. Why? Because the only way they can answer it is by thinking about their personal situation and what you've just covered. So that's a really important skill for keeping people's attention. As often as you can, get them doing things that personalize the material back to their environment. And that's often what you would do, for example, in a breakout group. Okay, let's move to solution 4. So we've got them engaged before the session. We've got them on board using the right technology, and they're listening to us. What we've got to do now is to avoid distractions. If you're using video, which I would recommend that you are on video, make sure that that also doesn't become a distraction. Now, if, for example, you are delivering a speech to a town hall meeting, you probably want the video to show you head, shoulders, and upper body at least, so that people can see your gesticulations, your mannerisms, etc. If you're running a training program, your video is there so they can just relate to you and they can hear and see you speaking. You probably don't want all of your gesticulations and body postures, etc., to be visible, because they're going to distract from what you're showing them on the screen and through the images. So make sure that your video is not distracting. Make sure it's supportive. Likewise, your voice, we've mentioned that earlier. Make sure that it's synchronized with the messages that you're delivering. You know, the classic, don't sound enthusiastic when you're just delivering some bad news. Body language, in particular there, be careful putting your hand up. I see so many people put their hand up, and of course if you put your hand up between you and the camera, which is probably quite close to you, you look like King Kong. It's not only distracting, it can actually completely spoil the atmosphere of the meeting, so that's careful. Here, this is a webinar, so we're breaking this one quite deliberately. In a training session, definitely try to avoid any period of more than 3 minutes where there isn't an interaction. And you may say, wow, that's not very long. Absolutely. Now, that interaction might simply be you ask someone to speak. It might be you ask them to put something in chat. It might be you change the visual on the screen. But if you don't do something every 3 minutes that interacts with them, you are going to lose them. This is why if you're watching a film or television, the screen actually changes approximately every 5.5 seconds. So 3 minutes is actually a heck of a long time compared to what Spielberg would recommend. Also avoid long sessions, and I recommend you avoid, if you can, long sessions with breaks, because I find people say, well, we're going to have a 3-hour session, we're going to have a break in the middle. Sometimes that's necessary because of the content and because of the client you're serving. The problem is, long sessions, you do start to see a reduced level of interaction and attention towards the end. People start thinking about what they're going to do next. And if you send people off to a break, you have two problems. One is frequently they accidentally or deliberately disconnect from the audio and the internet. And the other one is they don't come back on time because they get distracted during that break. So think really, really carefully about those. In a physical environment, you can usually go and find them. In a virtual one, you can't. The other thing is avoid peripheral input. You're going to want to make your sessions shorter, so really be ruthless about what is it they need to learn to apply during this session. Have as much of the pre-learning done as you can, and then in the session itself, really focus, and then try to avoid going off on tangents. That can quickly erode your time, and again, it becomes a distraction. So very often I'll actually say to people, John, you've made a really good point there. I'm going to take that offline and connect with you afterwards. If I think the discussion's useful for everyone, we can send out a note afterwards. Don't get distracted and lose 10 people because you've responded to one. And then lastly, keep alert to their environment. This is another reason why I like to have video on the participants. I can now watch what's happening. I can see the person who started answering their emails. I can see the person who's got up and trying to get the dog to leave the room. So be aware that their own environment can be a distraction, and you can do something about it. That takes us to solution 5. So we've got the right technology, we've pre-engaged them, we've got them on board initially, got their attention, and now we've avoided distraction. The question then is, how do you arouse interest? And some people say, well, what's the difference? The difference is this: if people are paying attention, they can hear you. They can see what's on the screen. That doesn't mean to say that you have any level of engagement. It might be a completely passive attention. What's really important is to arouse interest. You want people, when you ask for them to put stuff in the chat, to actually put chat in. That means they've got to be interested. If they're not interested, they won't. So just 4 suggestions about how to arouse interest. Number 1, keep signposting what's coming next. If they've signed up because they want to learn something from it, in the preparation, you told them what the benefits will be. Keep signposting that. Tease them. Make claims about the WIFM. What's in it for me? Say to them, in a moment, you'll notice 3 or 4 times I've been saying to you, and I'm coming back and I'm going to cover that point in a moment. I'm trying to make you think, I'll hang on till he does that. So try to raise some claims. Keep them interested. Reinforce the value. When you've covered a point and you believe they've got it, restate to them and say, okay, so what we've just done then, let's be clear, we can all go away now and do X. So restate, reinforce that value, and even ask 1 or 2 of the people to come back to you. And perhaps if Julie's online, say, so Julie, what is it we've just gained from that last 20 minutes that we've been talking about topic X? And then Julie will come forward. If Julie doesn't respond, Julie now knows she's got to be on her toes. So now you might ask Chris and say, okay, Chris, can you answer that question? Yeah. So by doing that, people start to realize that this is an activity they're engaged in. It's not something that they're passively observing. And then again, to arouse interest, use audible and visual stimuli. You notice significant changes in some of the slides. So anybody who's not been paying full attention, they go, that's interesting. That's different to the last one. So now they'll start listening. Why? Because they want to know why that's changed, why that's different. So then we move to, is the content suitable? And this is a really interesting one. And again, do you remember I said to you, repeat key things at least twice? One of the key things I said very early on is make sure when you're delivering the content, you keep that content tight and focused and you repeat it at least twice. Here's one where I'm going to say that. It's really important that you think about delivering that content, that content is suitable. The content needs to be pricey down tight so that you can fit it within the time and quite tightly. And thinking about what is suitable, yeah, you're going to ask people to learn about the content in advance. That's really important for a really effective virtual session. Give them material, get them coming to the session knowing about what it is the training session's about. Now you can get them to apply it, and that's substantially easier if the content is cognitive or interpersonal skills based. So it's around application of knowledge, so that might be around things like decision making, project management, those types of cognitive skills. Or it may be around interpersonal skills. So you may be talking about negotiation, persuading, influencing skills, for example. So make sure that you've got the right content. This is not good for things where you're expecting them to learn a physical collaborative skill or a physical skill, with the possible exception of how to operate a computer system, because obviously you can have screenshots and see the screens on screen, etc., and you can use share screen so that you can see their keyboard. But generally speaking, make sure that it's cognitive or interpersonal. Try to make sure that you've got sort of 3 to 7 key components. We're sharing with you 6 solutions today. It falls below the 7. We're currently on the 6th. You might be asking what comes next, and that is we're going to pull that together. We're going to bookend the material. But try to make sure that you've got 3 to 7 key points that you want to deliver. If it's more than that, break it up, have another session to cover the rest. And then within those 3 to 7, you might have lots of sub-points. But if you do, make sure they're very specific, make sure that they're critically important, and make sure that they are genuinely linked. It's very easy to lose people's attention and to damage their retention. So again, make sure that when you're covering a topic, you stick to that topic and the points you cover under it are specific, they matter, and they're interlinked. Your objective is to help them to learn, not to demonstrate the breadth of your knowledge and experience. You also want content that can be discussed with minimal pre-work. Why? Because you're going to engage them in discussion. You're going to have them completing chats. You're going to have them in breakout groups. You're going to have them coming on audio and giving you examples, explaining how this point relates to their work. That is the purpose of virtual sessions. So consequently, it's important that they can acquire sufficient level of knowledge before they get to the session. And I would say that's a really key point there. So can the topic be discussed with a minimal amount of pre-work? Also, can the work be personalized? So does the content give an opportunity for people to, during the session, apply it? Now, that you can't always do that, but most of the time you can. So if you're covering decision-making theory, for example, you might be talking about how to reach consensus. So what you could do is you could talk to them about nominal group theory, and you then give them a little exercise to go into a breakout group and do. You could then ask them to come back, and you then ask them to go back into the great breakout group and apply that concept to one of their problems, which you ask them to prepare in advance. So you get them to personalize it. That way they go away having remembered how they used the knowledge, not just the knowledge itself. And that, of course, means you've got to be careful to choose activities that are suited to a virtual environment. I recently was asked to run a virtual program where people were required to create an infographic. Now, you all know what an infographic is. It's where you've got lots of words, but they're put together in a way that forms a picture. That is really difficult to do if you're a group of people scattered across the globe with an internet connection. So find a way to create activities that can be done in a virtual environment. So typically they are around discussing things, applying them, evaluating them, seeking evidence for, or constructing an argument in advance for. So think about those things. And then, is your content suitable? Do you have ways to aid their recall? Now, your visual aids should to some extent do that. We've offered to provide you all with a handout after this session, so Mel will actually send that to you. We want to give you techniques and tips you can apply. Hopefully a number of you will have actually made a note of some of these things, so that you can actually go away and apply them. And always follow up. I know in theory we always follow up face to face. I also know with pressures on companies at the moment, we frequently don't. But it's absolutely crucial that we do follow up. And then lastly, what can go wrong? What can go wrong? Participants arrive late. That's why pre-advice is important. Get them to log in early. Participants experience technical difficulties. We've covered that. How do you handle that? Participants are audio visually impaired. I had one session, and this is an admission, one session where people were asked to call out the colours of things, and the person I chose actually was colourblind. Be really careful. Large font sizes, good colour contrasts, and check your audience. I had one participant who couldn't speak. That was an interesting one, so I had to prepare for that. Participants share their technology. Make sure if you're running virtual sessions, each person has their own PC and their own microphone. Otherwise, that's difficult. And we've already talked about people who are disruptive. We're at the end of the session. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Mel, do we have any questions in the chat that I've not answered that you've spotted?
Well, it's been going crazy. You did cover a lot of the questions.
I tried to.
There's so much. I mean, this is definitely more than an hour than we can cover in an hour. But I've been trying to group them up and to see some themes that are coming in with the questions. So I'm going to run through those. What are some recommendations on the type of platform? I know you touched on it, but several people ask, because there are a lot of different platforms and they're not created equal. If you could give a little bit more guidance for those who maybe do have the choice, because you don't always have the choice, right? It's oftentimes the enterprise that's telling you what to use.
You don't always have the choice. And again, I need to be fair here. I'm not biased or funded by any of the platforms. If you're going to do genuine interactive training frequently, for large, reasonable numbers of people, 16, 20 people at a time, I definitely recommend that you consider Adobe Acrobat, Microsoft Teams, or Webinar Jam. They're the ones that I'm familiar with. I wouldn't suggest that they're the only ones, but if you're looking for some to review, I'd review those. If you are not likely to have someone working with you as a host, you want something a little simpler, then certainly something like Zoom and to some extent Microsoft Teams can work for you. Um, it's also worth, if you want to explore a little bit wider, GoToMeeting and Google Hangouts. But my general recommendation for the upper end would be Adobe Acrobat, Webinar Jam, Microsoft Teams, and at the lower end, something like Zoom.
Okay, thanks so much, Clinton. And a lot of questions about, many people have these really large programs, right? 8 hour days, 5 days, 5 day programs. Can you talk a little bit more about best practices to kind of chunk
Absolutely.
those? How long should, this is a multi-question one, how long should sessions be ideally? And if you do them, how many breaks, things like that, if you could, because I know a lot of people are in that boat, having to take a lot of these face to face to online.
Yeah, and this is like if you ask a lawyer what the truth is. If you ask one lawyer, you'll get three answers. And the same is true here. Different people have different opinions, but you've asked me mine. Here is mine. If I'm taking an 8 hour face-to-face training program, my recommendation is that's probably going to be 2 2 hour sessions or 3 2 hour sessions. I personally would not go longer if I can avoid it. Now, sometimes you have to for pressure from the clients, etc., or from the participant group. So generally, I'd recommend 2 hours max. 2 hours max. You can, in a 2 hour max, have a very short coffee break. You make it absolutely clear that it's a very short coffee break. Very often, people will actually tolerate 2 hours without a break. So I would recommend that. And as I say, the first thing I do is look at the material. How much of this material can we send them in advance so that they can read it and become familiar with it, so that then in your virtual sessions, you're doing what typically you'd ask them to do when they go away after the training session. You're asking them to interpret it, to apply it, to think about it. So certainly an 8 hour session into 2 2 hour sessions or 3 2 hour sessions is definitely doable. What you have to be careful though, remember solution two, engage them in advance. They need to understand that doing the pre-work is not a choice. Doing the pre-work is a precondition. When they come on the session, if they haven't done the pre-work, they will be at a disadvantage. So it usually only happens once. Yeah.
And I think with that, someone was asking just now to how much time between sessions would you recommend?
If I'm breaking a face-to-face session up into modules, I go for one of two approaches. I'm working with a client actually in New Jersey next week, where we're doing one session on the Wednesday and we're doing one session on the Friday. That's because they didn't want to allocate a long session, but they didn't want a big gap between them. So that was their choice. Typically, I recommend that you have about a week between them, because it gives them chance to do something before the next one. So my preference is, if you're going to split something up, you do it a week apart. And what you'll frequently find is, if you agree with people that a Tuesday morning works, typically it works, each week. So normally, you can find patterns in people's schedules that does work.
Okay, so
By the
thanks
way, I
for
know
that.
we've
I
gone
know we have
longer
a
than
couple
some
more.
people. Mel, I know we've gone longer than some people expected. I'm more than happy to stay on if people would like. If not, I'll just quickly put up the slide, so people, if they want any information or want to contact us, they can. So anybody who wants to drop off, you've got that contact details. For others of you, if you're happy to stay on, Mel, I am.
I can stay on for a bit longer. Nolan and I were communicating behind the scenes
Good.
about staying on about 5 more extra minutes. I am going to go ahead because usually we bring this up during evaluation, but if you need to jump, let me go ahead and provide that download for everybody, which is a copy of the slides. We had a lot of people asking for this. Give me a second to pull that over. Just click on the name of the slide, the file name, click download file, it's going to open up a separate web browser window for you, and then you can download. We're also going to post it with the recording. So it's okay if you have to jump and you can't get this right now. We'll post it with the recording, and you'll get a link for the recording and the handout in one business day.
Excellent.
So with that, let's get back to some questions. So we talked about the chunking and time in between, an ideal length, and giving them breaks. We had some folks asking about doing system training. How would you suggest, doing the type of training that's really hands-on that you need to help the participant do and then see them doing? Recommendations for that?
Yeah,
Maybe a
yeah,
good platform.
that's a great question. Yeah, two things here is one is there is software available that you can use to record screens and keystrokes so that you can, if you like, simulate someone actually using a software system. So if you do a search on Google for training software systems, you'll find that there is software for recording it. But I think one of the other things is the sort of software we talked about this morning in Adobe Connect. It's possible to have screen share where you can actually take people through a demonstration and example, which you can either do live using sharing your own screen, or you can have slides that you've taken and walk them through it. But you can then ask each individual person to share their screen, and you can then watch what they're doing and interact with them. The downside, though, is if you try and do that in a group environment, you're breaking this keeping people's attention rule. Because if you've got 6 people and it's one person doing the activity whilst you watch, what are the other 4 or 5 doing? So you do need to be really careful. But one-to-one, you can definitely use these tools for doing that training, because you say you can use the screen share.
And Clinton, I know, and then someone also answered as well as I did in chat. I know WebEx has virtual labs that will do what he's asking, which is I want to see everybody's screen. It's separate from
Yeah.
WebEx training. It's separate from WebEx meeting and
Yes.
webinar. So the labs can do that as well. That's one platform. I know there's another one. I can't think of the name of it right now.
Yeah, and as I say, I'd be really careful. What I notice is, some people, we get very excited. I'm one of them. Get really excited. You find something and it's got all these wonderful whizzy-gigs and things it can do. Just be really careful. You really, if you're going to use them, make sure you know them really well. Make sure you're really skilled, or you've got a host working with you who does know them, because if not, they become a major distraction. And there's nothing worse than getting sort of a halfway through a training program, and then as a result of a technology glitch, you fall over. It's embarrassing at best. Yeah. Yes, Anis says Camtasia and Adobe Captivate. Yeah, both good screen captures. There's some others which actually not only capture the screens, Anis, they also capture the sequence of keys that were pressed, so you actually get an even better impression. But yeah, Camtasia or Adobe Acrobat, you can actually record. You can record the screen and what was done.
Well, speaking of technology glitches, I lost mine for a second. Did you hear and answer my question about doing soft skills?
No, I didn't hear that one. Yeah.
Okay, so I was saying on the flip side of doing tech courses, how about soft skills like role playing or any sort of soft skills training? Do you have recommendations and how well that works in this?
Yeah, I've found that works really well in the sense that you can do some of the classic ones. Now, I'm very, I'm sharing personal as well as industry standard information. On a personal level, I don't use what would be described as pure role play, which is where you get people to pretend. What I do is to get them to, act out a real situation. And you can do that in a variety of ways. It's a great thing to do in breakout groups. So you can break people out into groups of 3, 4, 5 people. You can give them a topic where one of them is the client, one of them is the salesperson, and they handle that discussion. But make it as real as you can. Somebody is the manager, somebody's the subordinate, and they're handling an appraisal or whatever. So you can do that in breakout groups, and that's when you would drop in and out of the breakout groups to make sure that they're doing what you've asked them to do. And that's a real benefit over a physical conference where you send them off into meeting rooms. In Adobe Connect, for example, you can drop in and out of the breakout rooms in seconds, and hear if they're working well and encourage them. Equally well, we didn't have video active on this today because it's a webinar, but if this was a training session, we'd have the video up, and we could have 2 people up, and we could have them having a conversation while the rest of us observe it. And we can have the chat being used to record comments. So we can have 2 people conducting, let's call it a role play, but they're conducting an interpersonal expression, interchange, and the other people are posting their notes in the chat box for a debrief that we have afterwards. So sometimes this can actually be better than face-to-face, where actually getting all of that input in one place is difficult. In a virtual environment, it's all in the chat in one place anyway. I think we must close now. We've
Yeah.
allowed people to indulge, which I was happy to do. So Nolan, do you want the
Yeah.
last word?
Yeah, thanks, Clinton. Usually Mel is reserved for the last word, but as you have said time and time again on this, test, retest, Mel's backup computer broke, just shut down, and her live one is also having an issue. So I'll go ahead and informally close this off. Thank you, Clinton, for sticking around. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And thank you very, very much again to eLearning Industry. Please give them your business. It is very well deserved. They have done a great service by giving access to everybody on this webinar. So thank you so much for joining. Again, the recording will be made available. Please give us a day or so to get that set up. Thank you so much.